Hi everyone, my name's Alana Page. I am taking education research through Northern Vermont University for their graduate program. I just finished reading the book, The Myth of the Normal Curve, edited by Kurt Dudley Marling and Alex Gurn. This is kind of my critical reading project for this course. I'm going to spend the next couple minutes sharing with you guys about the book itself, as well as some additional readings I did to have kind of another take about normal curves and their role in education, my points of learning, and some questions and challenges that are kind of tied together, and I'll finish off with our citations for each article. So jumping right in, the book itself, The Myth of the Normal Curve. Overall, it's a pretty easy read. I found it, if you're looking for a book to read or a quick read, one wonderful thing is at the end of each chapter, there's like a page or 2-page conclusion. That reading the chapter itself, you get a lot of information, but if you're quickly wanting to look up one of these topics, it's a great tool to have. So just as a suggestion. So really the book kind of goes through, it begins with really asking the question of what is normal? Is anyone normal? And we all probably intrinsically know nobody is normal. There's traits about us that are more common and we kind of expect, but we all have things that we're better at, stronger at than others. And from there, the authors really dive into, do people follow a normal curve? And that, no, we don't. So why are we trying to use these assessments on children to determine anything about them when none of us are normal? On page 16, there was a really moving quote. Sorry. All right. So this is right up top of the page on page 16, and they're really looking at our normal curves of representation of human behavior, and looking at the difference in between personality or IQ tests and achievement tests. So just because objective measures of achievement or ability produce a normal distribution does not mean what is being measured, math, reading, intelligence, so on, actually distributes normally among human populations. So we need to remember that all assessments are created to have a score. In the case of IQ or academic testing, they've been created to output this perfect bell curve, but that doesn't mean that people are actually following in a bell curve in those areas. It just means that the test produces a bell curve. This was really eye-opening because I, myself as an educator, have quickly used IQ scores, kind of using that bell curve to kind of quickly make judgments and make accommodations for students, and that is not best practice, but it is the truth of the matter sometimes when you get IEPs the day before you have kids come into your room. And I really realized that those tests aren't telling us about the actual kid, they're telling us about the test and how the kid can take the test. And the book moves through really first looking at the problems with special education, and then it moves into the problem of the tests have racism built into them, that they're not accessible for all of our students. And this isn't just an American problem, but also a problem overseas. They talked about in Europe, in Eastern Europe, the problem with Romney gypsies, and that they have this whole separate culture, so they're not able to access the assessments. And on page 63, we have a quote. One of the main practices denounced as a violation of these children's human rights is the procedure followed to assign them to such schools. From design to implementation, each step is more superstitious than scientific. The intelligence test used to diagnose students, for example, represents a significant barrier for Romna children who have not mastered the dominant language. Furthermore, it has been demonstrated that these tests do not take into account Romney culture, thus conflating cultural understanding and learning disabilities. In some cases, Romna children are assigned to special education without even taking the test and without the consent of their families. A clear violation of parental rights and access to the necessary information in order to make appropriate decisions regarding education of their children. While we acknowledge that many of these children need extra supports, their parents are encouraged only to send the children to separate schoolings with other Rama children. The European Committee on Romani Emancipation argues that Romani parents often agree to transfer their children to these schools under the pressure from experts. These parents' silence is usually constructed as lack of parental interest, but the ECRE notes Romani families, like parents all over the world, want the best futures for their children. So what we're seeing is, this is so similar if we think about historically in the U.S., there used to be tests for people to be allowed to vote, and they were about white culture so that it would block African Americans and Native Americans and people even that were new to the U.S. from getting their voting rights. And the same thing is happening with special education. That the tests aren't being given in a way that students can access them. Imagine being given a test on academics, but it's in a language you don't speak. You can't. I have very poor Spanish skills. If someone gave me a test in Spanish, I can guarantee I will fail. Not because I don't know how to do what they're asking, but because I can't access the test. We also see this come through in deaf culture, is one of the examples they gave with that deaf people were marginalized because it was looked at as being deaf was a deficit and it was out of the curve. So these people, we need to train them to be oral. And this really, for me, tied back to the presentation I made last semester about culture, about cultures and about how we each have our own truth from the, sorry, I can't remember the name of the book. I can picture the cover. But either way, it really tied back to that for me. And there's a great quote on page 81 where they're talking about the attempt to eliminate sign language and teach deaf children only through speech and lip reading. And this moved them to an oralist generation. And they were trying to do this to try to move them on the normal curve without accepting it's a different language and that's okay. And that was really, really hard for a whole group of people. The chapter that stood out the most for me out of this book was the ADHD case study. It follows a student and how he has been identified for special ed, but also how his own parents didn't understand that he was in special ed because he was in a mainstream classroom. So the parents themselves, even though they got this they went in for IEP meetings, they got the parental rights each time. They didn't understand that their child was in special ed because them being in special ed meant their child was pulled out of the class, like when they were in school. So they were like, oh, he's not in special ed because he's in the mainstream. He's in the normal classroom, even though the child was getting services. And it also takes a huge dive into the medication problem facing so many families and so many students in the U.S. and around the world around ADHD. Because it was saying, well, if the child was medicated, then they can perform. So the question is, does the normal curve kind of apply if the same student can have two different scores based off of if they take a stimulant? And then the book kind of wraps up, it talks about disabilities. It has kind of a little bit of more of the same, diving into different parts of disabilities that are affected by this normal curve. And then at the end, it dives into childhood development. On page 198, this stood out to me, that there is more than one way to understand, nurture, and respond to children. The American conceptualization of child development seems unnecessarily intense and rigid in expectations to her, a view similarly expressed by Warner. Alexandra does not hold the same value for science applied to childhood development, evident in her worried decision of her early childhood intervention and the numerous and to her seemingly contrived therapies available to American children. Yet it is assumed by school professionals that she shared the values in the American schools. So what this is really talking about is when children miss a developmental milestone, all the ways that we say, oh, they're not on that normal part of the curve, once they've missed a milestone. And we feel the need to give kids therapies and extra trainings and all these things when really they're being kids and we all develop differently, and sometimes it's not a big thing. So it's just kind of a quick overview of the book itself. They're really making an argument that we shouldn't be looking at people on a normal curve because we don't follow a normal curve. I looked at 2 additional readings. I'm going to talk about the one on the left side of the screen. You can see my cursor, this one. The impact on grading, the curve, and analysis, a simulation analysis. This was a great little paper that talked about, do grades actually follow a normal curve? We talk about grading to a curve. I know when I was in high school, it was something that was discussed a lot. Now I'm in middle school and it's not discussed as much. But they were really looking at this question of, do students' learning actually follow a normal curve? And what they found out is no. And that there's this whole thing of, it's unfair if we're lowering a grade to make it fit a curve. The quote that's up came from page 5. Many argue that it's unfair to automatically assign low grades to the lower end of the class when it's possible in some cases that all students have achieved a certain mastery of the material and deserve grades that recognize their level of performance. This is something I also saw when I was teaching in high school. Like, why would I, lower somebody's grade? I think this is one great thing that's coming with proficiency education is a move away from this, because the goal is for all of our kids to reach proficiency. So we don't want to see a normal curve because we want to see our kids on our, if we're using a 4-point rubric, we want to see them, more of them, moving to that 3 and 4, at least the 2. That's the whole goal. And then the other paper I looked at, Our Grades Are Not Normal, Improving Exam Score Models Using Logic Normal Distribution. This was a really math-heavy paper, but I had 2 big takeaways. For one, assignments are not, most of our assignments we give students, we don't want a normal curve out of. Because if we actually have a normal curve on an assignment, as teachers, we feel like we are failing, because that would mean that 50% of our kids are in that, are below the, and what we really want to see is 75, 80, 90% of our kids excelling. I mean, we really want to see all of them, but in actuality, for being realistic, there is going to be someone who struggles. And also that our grades don't follow curves in most classrooms. I'm going to quickly click over to this paper. I just wanted to show the graph of the grades. So this one right here, it's in the center of the screen. This is how the blue is how we think, and the pink is the, what actually, the simulated when they were testing. My question that came out of both of these is really, how do competency, proficiency-based grading play into all this? Because it's very different, and we want to see more kids moving to those 3s and 4s. So my points of learning. Normal curves are an outdated way to look at people. The assessments are creating those normal curves. People aren't actually following that bell. And people can be great at one thing and terrible at another, and that's okay. These assessments also have so many built-in biases that they're so unreliable unless you are a middle-class white male in a lot of ways. There's so many people that are left out if you're a non-native English speaker, all of these things. And then my big takeaway is our American as well as European from what we read, but for me, our American special ed system needs work. We need to do something about this. So I left with 3 big questions. How do we move away from normal curves when we've built systems on them? Do normal curves even have a place in education anymore? How can we change, update assessments to make them accessible for all? And as educators, we need to find a way to identify students who struggle. And how do we do this to get the appropriate services to the appropriate students if we take away a normal curve? So how do we change our system but still provide those special ed services to kids who need special ed services? This is something I really want to know, especially thinking about maybe going into administration. And these are my citations for both papers and